Walt was an old man. He had lived in the town of Graymill for most of his life. His shop was small and sat on the corner of Ash Street, between a bread cellar and a closed-down boot repair. The sign above the door had faded so much that most people could no longer read what it said. But the people of Graymill knew. They had always known. It was the toymaker's shop. Walt had run it alone for 11 years. His wife, Edna, had helped him before she passed. She used to paint the faces on the wooden dolls and hum while she worked. The shop felt different after she was gone. Quieter. Smaller somehow. But Walt still came in every morning, lit the fire, and sat at his bench. It was the only thing he knew how to do. That winter was the worst anyone in Graymill could remember. Snow came early and stayed late. The roads turned to ice. The wind blew in from the mountains and did not stop for weeks. People moved quickly between buildings, heads down, scarves pulled high. Nobody stood still outside for long. It was the kind of cold that made your bones feel thin. Walt's shop was not doing well. It had not been doing well for a long time. Families in Graymill were struggling that season and toys were not something people spent money on when they were struggling. He had sold only 3 things in the past month. A small spinning top to a grandfather. A painted horse to a woman who felt sorry for him. And a tiny boat to a boy who had saved up his own coins. His firewood was running low. He had counted what was left the evening before and it was not enough. He was rationing it now, adding only 1 log at a time and waiting until the room got truly cold before he added another. His fingers ached in the chill but he kept working. There was nothing else to do. On a Tuesday morning, just after the sun came up, Walt arrived at the shop and got the fire going with the last of the previous night's wood. He put the kettle on and sat down at his bench. Outside the window the street was white and empty. The snow had fallen again overnight and no one had come out yet to clear the paths. Walt picked up the piece of wood he had been working on for 3 days. It was going to be a sparrow. Small, wings half open, like it had just lifted off a branch. He was almost finished. He turned it in his fingers and found the spot where the wing needed more shaping and set his knife to it. He worked for about an hour before he noticed something outside. At first he thought it was a pile of cloth. A bundle of rags that the wind had pushed against the outer wall of his shop. It was pressed low and close to the stone, right where the wall was thickest and held the most warmth from the fire inside. Then it moved. Walt leaned forward and wiped the frost from the window glass with the back of his hand. He looked again. It was a child. A dragon child. Small and pale-scaled, the color of old ash. The scales should have been bright at that age but these were dull, almost gray, dulled by cold and days without proper shelter. The child's wings were folded tight against its back. Its arms were wrapped around itself. It was pressing its whole body flat against the stone wall as if trying to pull the warmth directly through it. The child was not begging. There was no sign held up. No hand stretched out. It was simply standing there, quiet and still, taking what small warmth it could from the wall and enduring everything else. Walt watched for a moment. He thought about his firewood. He thought about the cold coming through the gaps in the door frame. He thought about how the fire was already smaller than he wanted it to be and how the day was long and the wood was almost gone. Then he looked at the child again. The child's head was down. Its small shoulders were pulled up close to its ears. Every few seconds it shook, a deep full-body shiver that it could not control. It did not look up at the window. It did not look at anything. It had stopped watching for help the way a creature stops watching when it has been waiting too long. Walt set down his knife. He stood up slowly, his knees stiff from the cold, and walked to the door. He pulled back the bolt and turned the handle and pushed the door open. The cold came in hard and fast. His breath fogged immediately. The chill hit his face and hands and crept under his collar. The dragon child looked up. Its eyes were pale gold, bright in a face that was otherwise gray and exhausted. It looked at Walt the way a small thing looks at a large thing when it is too tired to run. Not quite fear. Not quite hope. Something in between. Walt said nothing. He did not wave the child in or call out or make any kind of gesture that might be misread. He simply stood to one side of the open door and waited. The wind blew. The child looked at the open door. Then at Walt. Then at the floor just inside the threshold where the warmth from the fire was just barely reaching. It took one small step forward. Then another. And then it was inside. Walt closed the door behind it and went to put another log on the fire. Walt did not speak right away. He let the child stand near the door for a moment, giving it time to adjust. The shop was small but it was dry and the fire gave off enough heat to feel the difference immediately after the bitter cold outside. The child's pale gold eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the shelves, the workbench, the tools hanging on the wall, the rows of carved figures standing in quiet lines. Walt went to the back corner of the shop where he kept a folded quilt on the shelf above his coat hooks. Edna had made it years ago from scraps of old cloth. Different patterns, different colors, all stitched together into something warm and a little uneven and completely her. Walt had kept it in the shop for cold mornings when the fire took time to get going. He used it himself sometimes, wrapped around his shoulders while he worked. He picked it up and walked back to the child. He held it out without making a big movement. Slow and easy, the way you might approach something small that had every reason to be nervous. The child watched his hands. Then it looked at the quilt. Then it looked at Walt's face. Walt just waited. After a moment the child reached out and took the edge of the quilt in its small clawed fingers. Walt helped drape it over the thin shoulders and the folded wings. The child pulled it tighter immediately, gathering the cloth around itself with both hands, and something in the tightness of that grip told Walt everything he needed to know about how long the cold had been. He pulled the low stool from beside his workbench and set it near the fire. The child sat. Walt looked at the fire. It had burned down to a modest flame, steady but small. He had been careful all morning, adding only what he needed. He counted what was left in the wood box beside the hearth. 4 logs. That was all. 4 logs to last the rest of the day and into the evening. He stood there for a moment looking at them. Then he picked up 2 and set them both on the fire. The flames took hold quickly. They rose and spread and the heat pushed out into the room in a way it had not all morning. The child made a soft sound and leaned slightly toward the warmth without seeming to realize it was doing so. Its shivering was still there but already a little less. Walt went back to his bench and sat down. He picked up the sparrow he had been working on. It was nearly done. Just the wing tips needed a little more shaping and the tail feathers needed thinning out. He set his knife to the wood and worked quietly, letting the sound of the shop fill the silence. The soft scrape of the blade. The occasional pop from the fire. The wind outside pressing against the window. He did not ask the child any questions. He did not look over too often. He let the child sit and be still and get warm in its own time. He had learned long ago, first with animals and then with shy children who sometimes wandered into his shop, that silence was often the kindest thing you could offer someone who had been through something hard. After a while he heard the shivering slow. He did not look up. He just kept working. The sparrow was coming together well. The wings had the right angle now, caught mid-motion, like the bird had just decided to leave the ground. Walt smoothed the edge of one wing with the flat of his thumb and held it up to the light from the window. The grain of the wood ran clean through the body. It was a good piece. He set it down on the bench and looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up again and walked over to the fire. The child looked up when Walt came close. Its eyes tracked the small wooden shape in his hand. Walt crouched down so he was closer to the child's level, his old knees protesting quietly, and held the sparrow out. The child looked at it. Then at Walt. Walt turned the bird slightly so the firelight caught the grain. The wood glowed warm brown and gold. The wings caught the light along their edges. The child reached out slowly with one trembling claw and took the sparrow from Walt's hand. It held the bird in both claws and looked at it closely. It turned it the way Walt had turned it, watching the light move across the wood. One small finger traced the line of the wing from base to tip, careful and gentle, as if it already understood that something careful had made it. Walt straightened up and went back to his bench. He did not say it was a gift. He did not say anything at all. He simply sat down and picked up a new piece of wood and began to think about what it wanted to be next. Behind him near the fire he heard the child shift on the stool. The quilt rustled. There was a long quiet moment. And then the shivering stopped. Not slowly. Not gradually fading out. It just stopped, the way a sound stops when the thing making it finally finds rest. Walt heard the change in the quality of the silence and knew without looking that the child had finally, after what had probably been a very long time, stopped being cold. He kept his eyes on his work. But the corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. He reached for his knife and kept carving. The fire had settled into a steady low burn by mid-morning. The child had not moved from the stool. It sat with the quilt pulled around its shoulders and the small wooden sparrow held in both claws, turning it slowly from time to time the way a person turns something over in their mind. The shivering was gone. The pale gold eyes were less tight than they had been at the door. The child was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the quiet of something enduring. The quiet of something resting. Walt worked at his bench and did not push for conversation. He was carving the rough shape of a bear. Nothing detailed yet, just the basic form pulled out of the block, the round head and the heavy shoulders and the suggestion of short legs. He worked slowly, the way he always worked, without hurrying, letting the shape come out at its own pace. It was the child who spoke first. The voice was small and a little rough, like something that had not been used in a while. The word came out careful and deliberate, the way a person speaks in a language they are still learning. They. Walt looked up. The child was looking at him. One small claw was pressed lightly to its own chest. They, it said again. Walt understood. He set down his knife and pressed his own hand to his chest. Walt, he said. The child repeated it quietly, trying the shape of it in its mouth. It came out a little different, the letters slightly rearranged by a tongue built for different sounds. But it was close enough. Walt nodded once and picked up his knife again. They. He turned the name over in his head. It was short and clean and suited the child somehow. Over the next hour, in pieces and with long quiet gaps between, the story came out. Vey's words were simple and sometimes broken, but Walt was a patient listener and he could fill in the spaces without much trouble. Vey's family had been crossing the Greyfell mountain pass when the storm hit. It came fast, the way the worst storms always did in that range, dropping visibility to nothing in minutes. They had been separated in the wind and the snow. Vey had come down the wrong side of the mountain and ended up in Greymill 2 days ago. 2 days. Walt kept his face still when he heard that. 2 days alone in that cold. 2 days in a town where no one had opened a door. He did not say anything about that. He just nodded slowly and kept his hands moving on the wood. Vey watched him carve for a while after that. The bear was taking shape now, the head tilting slightly to one side, giving it a look of mild curiosity. Vey seemed to find the process calming. Its breathing had evened out completely. Once or twice it looked down at the sparrow in its claws and then back up at Walt's hands moving on the new piece. By early afternoon the light through the window had gone gray and flat. Walt's stomach had been reminding him for an hour that he had not eaten. He had a habit of forgetting meals when he was working. Edna used to put a bowl directly on his bench when she thought he had gone too long without eating. He smiled a little at the memory and then let it go. He got up and went to the small back room behind the shop. It was barely larger than a closet. A shelf, a small stove, a pot, a single chair. He had brought soup from home that morning in a covered pot. Potato and onion, simple and thick, made from what was left in his kitchen. He had planned it to be his lunch and his dinner both, stretched across the day. He looked at the pot. Then he looked through the doorway at Vay sitting by the fire. He got 2 bowls down from the shelf. They did not match. One was chipped at the rim. He filled both and carried them out. Vay looked up when Walt set the bowl down in front of it. The child looked at the soup and then at Walt, and there was something in the pale gold eyes that was hard to look at directly. Not gratitude exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that came before gratitude, the look of a creature that had forgotten it was allowed to receive things. Walt sat down with his own bowl and ate. After a moment Vay ate too. They sat by the fire together without talking and finished the soup. Walt's bowl was a little less full than Vay's. He had not made an announcement about it. He had simply filled one bowl a little more than the other when he was in the back room where no one could see. The afternoon passed slowly. When the light outside began to fade, Walt started thinking about the night. The temperature would drop further after dark. The wind had already picked up again, rattling the window frame in its familiar way. He looked at Vay on the stool, still wrapped in Edna's quilt, the sparrow resting in its lap now, the small eyes growing heavy with the particular heaviness of a child who has finally felt safe enough to be tired. Walt got up quietly and went to the cabinet beside the coat hooks. On the top shelf, folded neatly, was his winter blanket. Thick wool, dark green, heavy enough to hold heat through the worst nights. He had brought it to the shop at the start of the cold season for the evenings when he stayed late. He took it down and carried it to Vay. The child was nearly asleep. Walt draped the blanket over the quilt, tucking it gently around the small folded wings and the thin shoulders. Vay stirred slightly and pulled it closer without fully waking. The sparrow stayed held in one loose claw even in sleep. Walt stood there for a moment looking at the child. Then he went to his bench, sat down in his coat, and picked up the bear. The room was getting colder now. The fire was low and the wood was gone, and Walt could feel the chill settling into the air around him. His fingers were stiff and his breath was just barely visible in the dim light. He could have woken Vay and shared the blanket. He could have stopped working and sat closer to the last of the heat. He did neither. He kept his coat on and kept his knife moving and let the child sleep warm. Walt woke up stiff. He had fallen asleep at his bench sometime in the deep hours of the night, his head resting on his folded arms, the half-carved bear still sitting in front of him. The candle had burned all the way down. The fire was nothing but cold ash. The shop was gray and dim, and the cold had settled into every corner of it overnight like something that had been waiting for permission to come in. He sat up slowly and pressed his hands flat on the bench until his back straightened. His neck ached. His fingers were stiff and slow. He opened and closed them a few times and looked toward the stool by the dead fire. Vay was gone. Walt stood up quickly, faster than his body wanted to move, and looked around the shop. The quilt was folded. Not perfectly, a little uneven at one corner, but folded and placed back on the stool with the green blanket on top of it, squared as neatly as small claws could manage. The wooden sparrow was sitting on top of the folded blanket. Walt looked at it for a moment. Then he heard something outside. He went to the window and wiped the frost away with his sleeve and looked out at Ash Street. Vay was standing on the pavement directly in front of the shop. The morning was pale and cold, the sky the color of old iron, the street still mostly empty. Vay was small against all that gray, pale-scaled and thin, the cold wind moving around it. But it was standing straight. Not pressed against the wall the way it had been yesterday morning. Standing in the middle of the pavement, facing outward, watching the street. A woman came around the corner pulling a cart. She had her scarf wrapped twice around her face and her eyes down against the wind. She would have walked straight past without looking up. Vay stepped forward. "Mister," Vay said. The word came out a little wrong but loud enough. The woman stopped and looked at the small dragon child standing in her path. Vay pointed at the shop door. Then pressed one claw to its own chest. Then pointed at the door again. The words came out slow and careful, each one placed like a stone being set into a wall. "Old man. Inside. Give warm. Give food. Give blanket." Vay paused and then added the last part with particular care. "When he had none." The woman stared at Vay for a moment. Then she looked at the shop. Then she pulled her cart a little closer and kept walking. Vay watched her go and then turned back to the street. Walt watched from the window. He did not go outside. He did not know what to do with what he was seeing, so he just stood at the window with his hand still raised from wiping the frost and watched. The next person to come down the street was an old farmer Walt recognized, a man named George who sold root vegetables from a stall on market days. George was a practical man who did not stop for much. He walked with purpose and his eyes were forward. Vay stepped into his path. George stopped and looked down at the small pale dragon child standing in front of him with its claws folded and its pale gold eyes steady and serious. Vay pointed at the shop. And said it again. "Old man. Inside. Give warm. Give food. Give blanket." When he had none. George looked at the shop. Then at Vay. Then at the shop again. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he gave a single slow nod and walked on. Walt turned away from the window and got the fire going again with the very last scraps of wood from the bottom of the box, mostly splinters and bark, barely enough to take the edge off the cold. He sat at his bench and tried to work, but his mind kept drifting back to the small figure standing outside in the gray morning saying the same words over and over to anyone who came near. The morning passed. Around midday Walt heard the door. He turned and George the farmer was standing in the doorway holding a bundle of firewood under each arm, the thick good kind, properly dried and heavy. He set both bundles down inside the door without saying much. Just looked around the shop for a moment and then looked at Walt. "Dragon child out front says you gave your last wood," George said. Walt opened his mouth. George put a hand up. "Don't," he said. And left. Walt sat looking at the two bundles of wood for a long time. An hour later the door opened again. It was the woman with the cart from the morning. She set a covered pot on the counter without explanation. Steam was coming from under the lid. Walt lifted it and found a thick bean stew, enough for several meals, still hot from her stove. She left before he could find the right words. Then a young man Walt barely knew came with a wool blanket. Then a girl of about 12 arrived carrying a basket with bread and dried fruit and a small jar of honey, and she said her mother had sent it and stood very straight while she said it like she had been told to deliver the message carefully. Then two men Walt had never spoken to arrived together and spent an hour stacking firewood against the side wall of the shop without being asked, working quietly and leaving without coming inside at all. By the time the light outside began to fade, Ash Street had changed. People who passed the shop slowed down. Some looked at Vay, still standing outside, still telling anyone who would listen. Some looked at the shop window. Some just looked at the pavement for a moment before walking on. But none of them walked past quite the same way they had that morning. Walt sat at his bench in a warm shop with more food than he had seen in weeks and listened to the fire crackling with good dry wood and could not entirely explain what was happening. He only knew that a small dragon child had stood in the cold all day and told the truth to strangers. And the truth had moved through Ash Street like heat through stone. Slowly. Quietly. And all the way through. The 3 days that followed were the quietest kind of good. Vay stayed in the shop. There was no discussion about it, no formal arrangement made. It simply happened the way natural things happen, gradually and without announcement. Walt set up a proper sleeping place in the back room, a folded blanket on the old cot he kept there for long working nights, and Vay slept on it each night with the green wool blanket pulled up and the wooden sparrow set carefully on the shelf above. During the days Vay sat near the bench and watched Walt work. Walt did not mind being watched. He had always worked better with someone nearby, even in silence. Edna used to sit in the chair by the window and read while he carved, and the sound of pages turning had been enough. Vay did not read but it watched with the same kind of quiet attention, pale gold eyes following Walt's hands, learning the rhythm of the knife and the wood without being told anything about it. On the second day Walt set a small flat piece of wood in front of Vay and placed a dull carving tool beside it. He said nothing. He just went back to his own work. Vay looked at the wood for a long time. Then picked up the tool. Then looked at Walt's hands. Then looked at the wood again. By the end of the afternoon Vay had gouged a shape into the surface that was not quite anything yet but had the clear intention of becoming something. Walt looked at it when Vay held it up. He tilted his head and studied it seriously the way he studied his own work. Then he nodded once. Vay's chest rose a little. The neighbors continued to come by. Not in large groups, just one or two at a time, quietly and without making a production of it. George came back on the second morning with more vegetables and stayed for a cup of tea and talked about the weather with Walt the way two people talk when they are really talking about something else entirely. The woman with the cart, whose name Walt learned was May, brought bread 2 days running and on the third day brought her daughter who was shy and stood behind her mother's arm until Vay held up the half-carved wooden shape and the girl forgot to be shy. The shop felt different those 3 days. Fuller somehow. Not loud. Just fuller. Walt noticed it most in the evenings when the street outside went quiet and the fire was going well and Vay was asleep in the back room. He would sit at his bench in the warm shop with good food on the shelf and enough wood stacked against the wall to last weeks and he would look at his hands and feel something he had not felt in a long time. Not happy exactly. Something steadier than happy. Something that sat deeper. It was on the morning of the third day that Walt heard it. He was at his bench and Vay was beside him working on the small carved shape, which had by now developed enough to be recognizable as some kind of animal, when a sound came from outside. A sound that was not wind and not cart wheels and not footsteps. It was a sound like enormous wings. Walt looked up. Vay heard it at the same moment. The small claws went still on the wood. The pale gold eyes went wide. Then Vay was off the stool and at the door before Walt had fully stood up, pulling it open and running out into the street. Walt followed. The town square was at the end of Ash Street, just visible from the shop door. Walt stepped outside into the cold morning air and looked toward it and stopped. She was enormous. The dragon that had landed in the square was large enough that her wings, still half extended, threw a shadow across 3 buildings. Her scales were deep gray, darker and richer than Vay's pale ash color, and they caught the winter light with a faint blue sheen. Her eyes were the same pale gold as Vay's but older, and right now they were scanning the square and the surrounding streets with an expression that Walt recognized immediately. It was the expression of a mother who has been searching for a very long time and is not yet sure what she is about to find. Vay ran across the square. The great dragon's eyes found the small pale figure running toward her and something in her whole body changed. The tension went out of the enormous shoulders. The half-extended wings folded slowly. She lowered her head all the way to the ground and Vay ran directly into the side of her face and wrapped both small arms as far around her jaw as they could reach. Walt stood at the entrance to the square and watched. He had not meant to intrude. He had followed without thinking and now he was not sure whether to stay or go back to the shop quietly and let this be what it was without him in it. But then Vay turned. The child looked across the square directly at Walt and then tugged at the great dragon's jaw, pulling with both claws, saying something in the low rumbling dragon tongue that Walt could not understand. The mother lifted her head and looked across the square. Her pale gold eyes found Walt. Walt stood very still. They tugged again and said something else. Then switched to human words, slow and clear, each one deliberate. He gave warm. When he had none. The mother looked at Walt for a long moment. Then she began to move toward him. Walt's instinct was to step back. She was very large and she was moving with purpose, and every reasonable part of his brain noted that he was a small old man in a thin coat. But his feet did not move. He stood at the entrance to the square with his hands at his sides and waited. She stopped in front of him. Her head came down slowly until her eyes were level with his. Walt could feel the warmth coming off her scales even in the cold air. Up close her eyes were extraordinary, pale gold and deep and full of something that was very old and very clear. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached back with one great claw and opened the leather satchel strapped across her side. She reached inside carefully, the way you reach for something that matters, and brought out a stone. It was smooth and round and fit in a closed hand. Deep red, the color of coals at their hottest, with something moving inside it, not light exactly, but warmth made visible somehow, shifting and slow like a living thing. She placed it in Walt's hands. The heat came through immediately. Not sharp or burning. Steady and deep, the kind of warmth that starts in your palms and moves up your arms and settles somewhere in the middle of your chest. Walt looked down at it and felt his throat tighten in a way that surprised him. They appeared at his elbow. Forever warm, they said quietly, looking up at Walt with those pale gold eyes. Never cold again. Walt looked at the stone. Then at they. Then up at the great dragon watching him with her ancient steady eyes. He did not have any words that felt big enough for the moment. So he did not try to find them. Instead something started in his chest, something light and sudden and completely beyond his control, and Walt laughed. A real laugh, full and warm, the kind that comes from somewhere unexpected and takes you with it. It was not the polite quiet laugh of an old man being gracious. It was the laugh of someone who has just been caught completely off guard by something wonderful. They looked up at him and then started laughing too, a small rumbling dragon sound that was unmistakably delighted. And in the cold quiet square on Ash Street, with winter all around and warmth in his hands, Walt laughed the way he had not laughed in years.